Chapter 10 of The Beautiful Mrs. Davenant by Violet Tweedale. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. Lord Leicester's Advice. Major Carlton was enjoying one of his little week-end shooting parties. Only 8 guns made up of 4 brother officers, himself and 3 neighbours. There were 16 people stopping in the house altogether, the number Claude considered just right. Not a crowd, yet enough to amuse one another. They had enjoyed excellent sport on Saturday, and now a bright October Sunday intervened. The shooting was to be renewed on Monday, and on Tuesday most of the guests would depart. It was Claude's last week of leave, and he was due back with his regiment on Saturday week. That morning the mother and son had conveyed several of their guests to church, amongst others Lord Leicester. Lord Leicester was a man who had achieved European fame, not indeed because of his own gifts, but because of his untiring interest in the gifts of others. He had been a diplomat by profession, but temperamentally he was so utterly unsuited to any work which necessitated holding his tongue, that after a short and hot career he retired into private freedom again, and gave free rein to his natural verbosity. He was as well known in certain European capitals as he was in London. He rarely saw the interior of the Lords, and never made a public speech that he could possibly avoid. He had never written anything but a couple of volumes of very indiscreet reminiscences, and he knew the histories, public and private, of half the celebrated males and females in Europe. His memory was well nigh perfect upon the particular subjects which really interested him. The Carltons were renowned in pre-war days for doing their guests very well. They had now reconstructed on the old lines. There had been the usual admirable breakfast served from 9 to 10 o'clock, and the usual groaning board at 1:30 luncheon. After which the party had split up and gone their different ways to work off the consequences of heavy indulgence, and prepare itself for afternoon tea and 8 o'clock dinner. It was towards 3:30 that Claude, strolling alone on the terrace, came upon his uncle doing likewise. As usual, Leicester was perfectly turned out. He was a very tall, extremely thin man, who gave the impression of being strung on live wires. He was rarely quiet for more than 5 minutes at a time, and rarely remained in one house for longer than 3 days. He hated being alone, and ran up to his nephew with palpable relief. "Oh, my boy, this is opportune," he exclaimed, linking his arm in Claude's. "You're game for a walk, aren't you? We've had no exercise today, and we've got dinner looming ahead. By the way, how excellent that homard à la crème was at lunch. I hope you'll stick to this cook. She's a ripper. The smoking room's full of lazy devils snoring disgustingly, and the women have all gone to scratch the pig's back with your mother. I wish we were all as ready to die as your Tamworths. The fact is, Claudie, I want to make a call." "A call?" answered his nephew blankly. "Who the deuce do you want to call upon?" "Mrs. Davenant," returned Leicester with a confidential drop in his voice. "Oh, you know her then, do you?" exclaimed Carlton with surprise and interest. "I believe I've met her. I recognised her in church this morning. Wonderful how one meets people in the most out-of-the-way, unexpected places. One of the most beautiful women I ever knew. I rescued out of a leaking boat on the Danube. We were both quite alone. I've no doubt Mrs. Davenant will remember me. Besides, she's a tenant of your dower house, and I was your guardian. I really think it would be only civil to call." Claude required no pressing, but he smiled inwardly at the feebleness of the excuses. "Oh, right you are. Let's start at once," he answered, and with one accord they turned and made for the short cut across the fields to Little Glentworth. "I didn't mention to your mother my desire to visit those 2 ladies," Leicester went on to confide to his nephew as they walked briskly along. "I thought it better not, until I had formed an opinion of my own. I didn't detect any particular signs of enthusiasm when I referred to the presence of Mrs. Davenant and her friend in church. I didn't pursue the subject, recollecting that I had no personal impression to fall back upon. I hope to be able to speak of them in the future as everything that is delightful and correct. You met them in London, I suppose, hazarded Claude, who was secretly irritated by the tinge of doubt conveyed in his uncle's voice. He did not know that Leicester was given to assuming that he knew everyone till events proved the contrary, and that he then formed a new friendship on discovering it was not an old one. Somewhere in town. I really forget where for the moment," he muttered vaguely. "But of course Mrs. Davenant was a well-known figure in a certain clique of London society. Not, be it understood, in our real old aristocracy, but in that delightful suburb of the old where extremes meet, and where the pace is often a little too hot to last. I think also I remember her at Marienbad, or was it Carlsbad? I really forget. You are satisfied with her as a neighbour?" "I find both ladies delightful. I also had heard of the beautiful Mrs. Davenant in London, but I never chanced to meet her. She and my mother seem to hit it off all right together." "Oh, Sybil would," retorted Leicester dogmatically. "She is a thoroughly sensible woman, and doesn't concern herself with the private affairs of others. I suppose Mrs. Davenant has never mentioned her late husband to you?" "Never. Why should she?" "Oh, why indeed, dear boy? There's probably every reason she should not. Mrs. Davenant arrived in London a certain number of years ago with what I might call a Near Eastern reputation. No one knew her except through having met her in fashionable continental resorts, the continental watering places where one encounters delightful English people, with whom one soon becomes intimate if one is rich, and who express the hope of meeting again in London. From such beginnings the beautiful Mrs. Davenant picked up quite a respectable circle when she arrived in London, and settled down in the West End before the war. No doubt she formed an inner circle for her own amusement. That is very simply arranged. But up to now she has preserved a certain bulwark of stark respectability upon which she could always fall back. That interests me. It shows cleverness. Such bulwarks are becoming very thin, owing to constant encroachments from without. They are like our old sea-walls, constantly crumbling. Now one may say they are down." Carlton did not reply. He was conscious of a strong resentment rising within him. Why the deuce did everyone hint at some mystery connected with Mrs. Davenant? Probably the only reason why she didn't mention her husband was because he'd been a damned blackguard, and her only desire was to forget him. Though his mind was constantly occupied with other things, the memory of Mrs. Davenant at odd moments had been frequently shining through at him, and he was conscious of an interest in her which surprised him, and which he tried to stifle. He contrived to divert Leicester's attention from the controversial subject until they came in sight of Little Glentworth, lying sleepily silent in the blaze of a red October sunset. In another 5 minutes they found themselves being ushered into the drawing-room and into the presence of both ladies. Mrs. Davenant was seated in the window, a yellow-backed novel in her hand. Miss Howard was frankly sleeping on the sofa. She moved slowly into a sitting posture, in no way disturbed at being caught napping, while Mrs. Davenant rose to receive her guests with her flashing smile and air of charming cordiality. "What energy!" she exclaimed. "Church in the morning and a 2-mile walk in the afternoon. Oh, do sit down, Lord Leicester. You say we've met before? Oh, that is very probable. Where was it? At Homburg? Everyone used to meet there." Leicester had sunk into the depths of an armchair beside that of his hostess. "Yes, at Homburg. Of course, I instantly recognised you in church this morning, and I said to myself, bless my soul, surely that's the beautiful Mrs. Davenant. Of course, I knew that a lady of that name had taken Little Glentworth, but I had not realised that it was the Mrs. Davenant. The worst of meeting a beautiful woman is that one forgets all about the circumstances in the vividness of the fact. So you've actually settled down in the depths of the country. Dear me, what a change, to be sure." "Oh, it's a very happy change," Mrs. Davenant assured him. "Both of us were getting rather bored by town life. Everything is made so very unpleasant now, what with the food scrimmage and the constant labour troubles, and here we've no feeling of being buried. One can always get away. I delight in Little Glentworth and all its surroundings." Leicester glanced around him carelessly. As a matter of fact, nothing his eye lit upon remained unnoticed. "Oh, unfortunately one must live somewhere. I try hard to live nowhere. I prefer to be sous la branche. But my sister, who is supposed to keep house for me, likes a settled habitation, which I return to at intervals." Meanwhile Carlton had settled down to make himself agreeable to Miss Howard, and he did not fail to remark, as she sat up rather languidly on the sofa, that the curves of her figure were exceedingly graceful, and her welcome as cordial as that of Mrs. Davenant, only more subdued and ethereal. She was indeed a very striking-looking woman, and instinct with a graciousness which showed itself in every movement, and focused itself in her dark, intelligent eyes, whilst her voice had a pathetic note in it which vibrated with sympathy. "I want to hear about yesterday," she said. "We thought of you all lunching out. The day was so beautiful. It was awfully kind of you and Mrs. Carlton to ask us to join you, but that sort of thing is hardly in our line, and we always think outsiders are looked on rather as intruders by a house party." "Oh, I don't think either you or Mrs. Davenant are ever likely to be looked upon in that light," he answered. "We had a ripping day's sport, and we lunched in a shed erected for the purpose in a field. The weather was ideal. We were very cheery. It was a good wind-up to my leave. I'm off this week." "Oh, but you'll return again shortly." "I'll get Christmas leave," he told her. "Probably I'll get back about the 12th of December. We generally finish off the pheasants then, and I do a bit of hunting." "You'll be here for Christmas?" he added. Miss Howard nodded. "Hilda seems so enamoured of this place that she's no desire to go away anywhere. Perhaps when February comes she'll get her usual longing for the Riviera. I'm sure I shall." "Let's all do a month together at Monte," he suggested suddenly. "I've generally run out there about March or for Easter." "Oh, that would be delightful," she agreed. "By then travelling will be cleaner, and things in general may have settled down." He shrugged. "Things won't settle down again in our lifetime, Miss Howard, but here one can live in tolerable comfort. I blot out the last 5 years and try to revert to 1914. He felt his imagination stirring, as it always did in the presence of those two women. They somehow suggested to his mind the movements of gay crowds, lamplit gardens, shady nooks with blazing sunshine beyond, a blue sea, and snowy villas nestling amid olives. The wild oats of his early youth seemed to flourish afresh, whilst all the time he talked trivialities about the neighbourhood and his coming absence, and watched the evening light fall on Agnes Howard's slim hands and graceful form. But attractive as she was, the room held a still greater attraction for Major Carlton. As he was beginning to think the visit was rather a waste of time, and as he was about to consult his watch, the conversation became general. He caught the eye of Mrs. Davenant, who threw him a very bright glance of encouragement. "Lord Leicester is a mine of reminiscences," she said. Leicester gave a modest disclaimer with his hands. "Oh, I keep my ears and eyes open, and everything that concerns my fellow creatures interests me. I was just about to tell Mrs. Davenant of a most amusing supper party we had last week. We sat down 20, and every one of us had been in prison." "I never heard that you'd done time," laughed Carlton.
"I confess I was rather a fraud amongst genuine cases," admitted Lester. "I heard of the party being arranged by an old friend of mine, Mrs. Jessup, old Gladbrook's daughter. She used to be always in and out of prison in 1913 and 14, where prison was the rage. I wished to go to the party, but the only claim I had was the fact that I had been arrested in Petrograd in mistake for a well-known anarchist, and did 24 hours in Peter and Paul till our embassy got going. I mention the incident in my book, The Indiscretions of a Diplomat. All the other guests had an intimate acquaintance with English prison and their antediluvian methods. There was Lady Penrose. She had 6 weeks for throwing squibs into letterboxes and burning all the housemaids' love letters. Then Willie Walters was there. He'd done 6 months for leading a mob down Piccadilly and looting all the shops on the way.
"Oh, how one forgets!" laughed Carlton, during a pause in which Lester recovered his breath.
"I remember now. He's been a cabinet minister since."
"Whitewashed and warranted, highly respectable," went on Lester.
"Then Galen Orchard was there. He's one of those Irish chaps, always in and out of prison, a regular jailbird and a most charming fellow. One of our greatest classical scholars. He brought with him that very handsome Mrs. O'Connell, who's such a revolutionary. She's had at least 2 husbands shot. Then, by the way, Lady Mary Allen came. She's a connection of mine. She got 3 months as Mary Brown, but they found out she was an earl's daughter and chucked her out after a week or 2. Finch, MP, was another guest. He was once sentenced to be hanged, but he continued somehow or other to escape, and now he's in sanctuary at Westminster. To crown the evening's entertainment, Lady Coleman was carried in on a stretcher decorated with suffragette ribbons. She was got up to look as if she'd just been released from a hunger strike under the cat-and-mouse bill."
"Oh, those thrilling days seem very far removed from our present conditions," said Mrs. Davenant. "But we'd never have gained the vote without them," chimed in Miss Howard. Lester shrugged his shoulders.
"All those topsy-turvy incidents made London so much more amusing than it is now. Men home from Russia say they've seen nothing so Bolshevist as London. It has all the appearance of being the capital of a nation that's gone crazy from Bolshevist rabies. The restaurants are merely banditti strongholds. The busmen are frenzied corsairs in charge of juggernauts. The shop-girls are replicas of the women of the French Revolution. Even the dustmen are terrorists. Oh, I often sigh for Victorian days. After King Edward's death I feared we would all become too good to live. We were threatened by a most painful wave of Puritanism, but all sorts of thrilling novelties cropped up and saved us."
"The women, for instance," suggested Mrs. Davenant. "You find now that you can't generalise about our sex. That's their charm, Lord Leicester. Each is a law to herself, and they have such wonderful recuperative powers. In their youth they pass through the most appalling tragedies, which by middle age have become mere mirages draped in heliotrope memories." Leicester watched her sharply and then laughed.
Yes, we owe the suffragettes a debt for presenting us with new sensations. I was never in favour of suppressing them. Certainly Woman's Day has dawned, and now the House of Commons has decided to be funny, and has dropped its absurd pose of pompous superiority, we're getting along much better. I always say we're all right as long as we have a government that makes no attempt to govern."
"Oh, you'll stop to tea?" asked Mrs. Davenant, seeing that Carlton had risen and was trying to arrest his uncle's verbosity by laying a heavy hand on his shoulder.
"Oh, I fear we can't to-day, thanks. I must be getting home to my guests," he answered, his thoughts busy with her beauty and charm of manner.
He held the hand she gave him lingeringly.
"I was very disappointed about yesterday," he found himself saying, with a sort of unconscious shyness.
And then, hearing Lester talking volubly to Miss Howard, he added in a low voice,
"It made all the difference to my day."
She seemed not to hear his last words. Her tones were merely kind and friendly. "But even if we had come, we shouldn't have had many words with you. I know what real business those shoots are. No lingering behind after lunch on those short afternoons. The host is always more or less preoccupied." He shook his head dissentingly. "I may come to say good-bye? I'm off at the end of next week." "Why, of course. Come when you like. We shall miss you when you go," she said. During the walk home, Leicester monopolised the whole of the conversation. Carlton listened and smoked one cigarette after another in moody silence. His uncle was sentimental and cynical by turns, as was his wont.
"Perfectly charming and undoubtedly lovely. Makes one realise how many pretty women there are, and how very few lovely ones. Mysterious. Yes, my boy, that's undoubtedly where the real charm lies, in the mystery of her. I can remember in the good old days, one winter at Nice, a lot of us were held there for months by one veiled woman. She was American and went everywhere, but no one ever saw her face unveiled. We sat in her opera box, we played bridge and 30 et 40 alongside her. We danced with her. She had a divine figure, but not one of us ever saw her face. One chap bet 1,000 guineas to one he'd unveil her in a week. He lost his money. Probably she was hideous, but she was the rage, because it got rumoured about she was so lovely no man could look upon her and live. She had a husband, by the way. He managed to survive."
"Who is Mrs. Davenant? What is she? What's her game? Has she had a sickener of conquests, and come here to find something easy to practise upon, just to keep her hand in? One doesn't meet with such beauty every day. Certainly not hidden away in the country. That adds to the mystery. Now, if she's really a widow, why hasn't she made a brilliant second marriage?" Leicester paused for the first time to get his second wind. He seemed to expect an answer to his numerous questions.
"How the devil should I know?" was Claude's rather sulky retort.
Leicester noted the hardly suppressed irritation, and proceeded to rub it in relentlessly.
"One can see at once that she's had any amount of experience, and the terms of experience are invariably very high. Damned old usurer, experience is. She's kept young, so clearly her life's been a success. She seems to have settled down, which as a rule requires the deuce of a settling up, and she's the type of woman who could make any man under and over 40 a doddering imbecile. I don't mean that every man would lose his heart to her. I mean that most men would lose their heads over her. A very different matter."
Carlton thought of the smile he had caught Leicester bestowing upon the lady in question. It was the smile with which certain men will always smile at something lovely, whether their wives approve or not.
"I was always a freelance," went on Uncle Leicester in lingering and sentimental tones, "simply because I was clever enough to recognise my own limitations. I've always considered marriage as a most difficult profession for which one ought to have a stiff apprenticeship. The great thing is not to expect more of marriage than there is in it. Someone must get the worst of every bargain. It is absurd to rush into so very complicated an adventure without any preliminary training. That is why women on marrying must always submit to guidance. They haven't had our advantages."
Looks as if a widow might not be such a bad investment," struck in Carlton with dry humour. For just a second Leicester was nonplussed.
"Widows are charming," he conceded readily, "but widowhood has become such a vocation. It's quite overdone. And they all begin by refusing in the same words the man who proposes to them. 'No, thanks, I know when I'm well off.' A most painful beginning. I believe I did hear one variation. Once bit, twice shy. Equally offensive, I consider. Widows as wives have two serious drawbacks. You've always to keep in active competition with defunct number one, and widows are so devilish independent. Directly a woman knows the ropes, she's off down the course with the bit between her teeth. Widows are never domesticated. My contention is that no women, not even charwomen, are domesticated. We liked in Victorian days to pretend they were, but the death struggle going on, a drawing-room versus servants' hall, has exposed the fallacy. If I were a woman, I put it to you, dear boy, should we enjoy having babies and depending for our orgies on the linen cupboards and storerooms? Oh, no, you bet we wouldn't, laughed Carlton. I do sometimes remember that it must be rather a bore for women always to be thinking of how they can best feed us. Women themselves don't care a damn what they eat. They seem to share with the zoo bears a passion for buns, so I've been told, agreed Lester, and then, conscious that he had not quite accomplished his original intentions, he dashed off again on the subject of matrimony. No man, if he wishes to keep young, should dream of marriage before he's 40. He should be contented till then with other men's wives. They'll teach him what marriage means, and always remember that a reputation for success in love is a tremendous asset with women. They tumble to it like nothing else. Of course, to be a lover and a husband combined is a fine art which few acquire, but there you are. Lovers are born, not made. A born lover has his own methods of making love. He treats the art with the respect it deserves. He studies his part, taking into consideration his personal appearance, his staying powers, etc. For instance, a man of my build and the short, stubby, thick-set man should make love in totally different ways. I could always rush an affair with a fair chance of success. The short, stubby man has to plod. His hope of success would lie in dogged perseverance and a stubborn wearing down of opposition. But he gets there, if only he can stay the course. Carlton laughed rather grimly. He was getting rather bored by the veiled lecture. I'll remember all your tips if ever the day does come when I contemplate matrimony, he said dryly. Oh, you? Lester waved an airy hand. Of course, I spotted at once that you weren't running in any matrimonial stakes when you left the Dower House. Carlton turned sharply round and stared at the speaker. By Jove, he exclaimed, how extraordinary! I simply never thought of that before. Lester's eyes followed a covey of partridges. He said nothing. Later on that evening, Lester seated himself beside Mrs. Carlton and Mrs. Hall at the far end of the long drawing-room. The rest of the party were out of earshot, chattering in groups together around the bright wood fire. No card games were ever played on Sunday at Great Glentworth, but often a neighbour or two drove over to dine in a friendly, unceremonious fashion. Captain Hall was really too vigorous a sportsman to dine out on any other day but Sunday. He was inclined to be sleepy and tired after many hours passed in the open air in hard exercise. Sadie enjoyed those informal evenings. She enjoyed showing off her latest Parisian novelties to the house party, and Mrs. Carlton was always such a splendid foil in her evening uniform of black velvet, high to the throat and cut on the severest lines. Even the magnificent diamond cross upon her breast failed to detract from the strictly masculine appearance she affected, and which somehow suited her as no other style of dress could or would. "Did Claudie tell you where we went this afternoon?" asked Lester, drawing up a low chair close to the two women. Mrs. Carlton put her glass in one eye and answered, "No. Where did you go?" "To call on Mrs. Davenant." For a moment she answered nothing, and Mrs. Hall struck in. "I like Mrs. Davenant, but I've told Jim pretty plainly that I won't have any fooling around in that quarter. There's no real harm in Jim, but folks might think there was if he got into the habit of always dropping in at Little Glentworth, just as some men drop into every inn they pass. Though I like her, I think she's dangerous." Mrs. Carlton seemed to have been thinking hard, and Lester guessed her thoughts.
She sat with her close-cropped head slightly bent, and her thin brown fingers mechanically smoothing her black velvet lap.
I've an impression, though I've really nothing to go on, that it would be useless for any man to fall in love with Mrs. Davenant, because she isn't free."
Leicester grinned.
"Oh, my dear Sybil, what an argument!" he expostulated. "As a matter of fact, to love someone you've no right to love is by far the most enthralling love of all. It adds more guilt to the gingerbread than anything else I know. As a bachelor, I can speak from experience. Certainly, if you are right in your supposition, we may safely place the lady outside the danger zone, but I shouldn't say it would be useless for any man to fall in love with her, owing to the reason you suggest. Women who are unattainable have an enormous attraction."
"But if one were only certain that no man could marry her," suggested Mrs. Carleton with unconcealed anxiety.
"Oh, if. Of course there are lots of men who will simply do anything for a woman except marry her. Conceivably that may be why the lady in question remains a widow."
Mrs. Carleton smiled incredulously and silently shook her head.
"She prefers men to women. She's practically said so," resumed Sadie with a certain warmth. "Oh, I know men are under the ridiculous delusion that women can't admire one another. That's pure nonsense. The truth is, we don't always believe that a beautiful face implies a beautiful nature. Mrs. Davenant's got one of those intensely feminine faces that add so much to beauty of feature. They cause a man to realize the strong contrast between the sexes." "Oh, God be praised!" ejaculated Leicester piously. "Helps one to bear with this new gender that the war's produced. Mrs. Davenant's all right for women, but I maintain she's dangerous for men."
"I think, Sadie, Mrs. Davenant's openly expressing devotion to men was intended as a warning," said Mrs. Carleton, speaking very deliberately. "It was meant as a warning to women to keep away. She doesn't want any of us about her. We might find out something." "She may only have divorced her husband," suggested Mrs. Hall, but Leicester shook his head.
"Only ugly women are so recklessly improvident," he declared seriously. "Foolish creatures, they never think of how their men are to be replaced. Where does Mrs. Davenant get her money from?"
"Oh, ask me another," laughed Sadie. "Why does no one ever discuss Miss Howard? She's quite as mysterious as the other, and a very handsome woman," mused Mrs. Carleton aloud. "I hear the vicar's enormously attracted in that quarter," struck in Mrs. Hall maliciously. "He admires them both because they don't jazz." Leicester looked serious.
"I approve of the clergy marrying. They're rather out of date as husbands. They make most useful relations. I remember they used to be fashionable as husbands in the old Queen's reign, at least the muscular Christian types were, but I've never heard that they'd come in again. Shouldn't wonder if there was an after-the-war boom in them now." "What are you three discussing so mysteriously?" demanded Claude, who had strolled up to them unperceived. "Oh, family affairs, dear boy, and the decay of religious observance in the stately homes of England," rapped out Leicester flippantly.
End of chapter 10.